Greg Phillips back at the Fender stand with Alan Abassi, and we're in front of the American Original series. Tell me the story behind the series.
Well, we've actually been making vintage, quote-unquote, vintage reissues since the 80s. It's one of our most beloved style of instruments. It harkens back to the legacy of Fender. It's us making guitars the way we did it in the 50s and 60s. For this new series, we wanted to do that with a little bit of a twist, so you'll notice that we used to have a lot of different year-specific models. Like for 50-style Strats, we used to have a 56 and a 1959 Strat. For this new series, we decided to go with decades instead of specific years. So we have a 50s Strat and a 60s Strat and a 50s Tele. And what that allows us to do is kind of pick and choose the best features that would have occurred in those entire decades instead of just one particular year, which is kind of fun because what you can do is, for instance, on our new 50s Strat, we've got a very thick, soft V-neck shape that we borrowed from our 56 Strat, but the pickups are from a 59 Strat. So it allows you to kind of mix and match all the best elements of all the different era-specific features. So the new series is all lacquer. It's all our best pickups that we're still using from the last series. All the vintage hardware, vintage neck shapes, but we've thrown in a little bit of a twist with some features that are a little bit more modern in orientation. For instance, the radii of all the necks is flatter. It's a 9.5-inch radius, which means you can set your action lower, you can bend a little better. It's a little more familiar to modern players for the feel and action. Also, the frets used to be vintage frets on these instruments that we made, the vintage reissue stuff, and we made them a tiny little bit taller. They're still vintage profile frets, but we added just a little bit of material there. And that, again, aids in bending notes. It also gives you a little bit more life out of the frets. So if you do level crown and polish, you probably get an extra level crown and polish or two. You'll also notice that our last series had been whittled down to just a few color options. And for this new American Original series, we've brought out the full rainbow of colors here. You'll see everything from ocean turquoise to Lake Placid blue to white blonde, surf green, all the cool Fender vintage colors. So that's really exciting. That's always one of the most fun things about the vintage instruments is the cool colors.
So some of the elements that possibly aren't as popular these days, you just don't include them, and
Exactly, like on vintage style Strats, you know, they would have come with 3-way switches. But most, I would say 90% or more of the guitar players out there like a 5-way switch on their Strat. So all these vintage style Strats have 5-way switches. We also reintroduced our custom Telecaster, which is a vintage style 60s Tele with a double bound body that you see behind us here. You could probably get a shot of it in a little bit. That was always a very popular model, and we discontinued it for many years, and we got a lot of requests to redo it, so we're doing that. And then again, of course, Jaguars and Jazz Masters are perennially popular these days, and we've added some really fun, cool vintage colors into those. And then the 70s Jazz basses at the end are so vintage correct that we're actually doing those in polyurethane, not lacquer, because that's what it would have been in the 70s.
maybe you should pull a couple off the wall.
Yeah, let's grab one of these. So what we're looking at here is one of the new American Original 60s Teles. As you can see, one of the main features here is this beautiful binding. This happens to be Lake Placid blue, which is a very cool Fender vintage color, but the white really pops with the white guard. It's just a great aesthetic. And again, we've got a vintage style C neck shape, so it's a little bit chunkier. It feels really great in your hand. Rosewood neck, pure vintage 64 pickups, which are one of my favorite Tele pickups that we make. So this is all lacquer, vintage correct hardware. The other cool thing about this new American Original series is we've brought the price down to a much more attractive price point, so people that are buying them are going to love that. But this is the Lake Placid Blue American Original 60s Telecaster. What we're looking at here is the American Original 60s Jazz Master. This is an ocean turquoise with a tortoiseshell guard. This may look familiar to people that remember the Elite color swaps that we did. We did this color scheme on the American Elites just last year. But again, 9.5-inch radius, so it's a little easier to bend a note. Lacquer finish, American or pure vintage 65 pickups, all vintage hardware. The 60s Jazzmaster neck with binding, pearl dots. This is classic Fender Jazzmaster right here. That is the American Original 60s Jazzmaster. What I've got here is the American Original 50 Strat in Aztec gold. So not to be repetitive, but again, We flattened out the radius, so it's 9.5 inches. The frets are a tiny bit taller, so it's just a little bit easier to bend notes and play. This has got a really thick, soft V shape, which I happen to love. And that's borrowed from a 56 Strat, and then, of course, the 59 pickups. We did a lot of testing of all the various pure vintage style pickups that we make to pick and choose which ones we wanted on these series, and the 59's one for the 50 Strat. Aztec gold lacquer, all vintage hardware, at a much more attractive price. That's the American Original 50 Strat.